Breaking news, this is your World War III update. I just want to give you guys a quick breakdown of the NATO plans to deploy troops into Western Ukraine in a non-combatant role. We also need to talk about the suspicious maneuvering of Russia's nuclear forces, and they're doing it in plain sight under the guise of preparations for Victory Day. Now, the problem is that Victory Day is not until May 9th. So I'm not sure why you would feel the need to break out the nukes 2.5 months early when it's really frickin' cold outside and you're preoccupied in Ukraine at the moment. And this is something you've done every year for like 40 or 50 years, okay? So this is something that doesn't really need a lot of practice. You're basically taking them out of the silos, you drive them down Moscow's main road for one day, and that's it, okay? This is nothing that needs a lot of coordination and rehearsal. As some of you know, New START 2, which is a treaty which is effectively now defunct because neither side is honoring nuclear inspections, and I'm talking about the United States and Russia, most, if not all, of the nuclear treaties are now suspended or non-existent or defunct and not being honored anymore. And part of that treaty was the information sharing that happened between the countries. The Russians would notify the Americans if they were moving their nuclear forces, if they were going to be doing a nuclear test, because they didn't want anything to be misinterpreted as real world when it was just an exercise. And the Americans are constantly watching these areas to see what is going on. So if the Russians just spontaneously decide to move a nuke somewhere, that could potentially spook somebody in Washington and lead to a thermonuclear accident. We don't want that to happen. I think that this maneuvering, this posturing so early on, 2.5 months ahead of Patriot Day, under the guise of Patriot Day, is sending a veiled message to Washington in response to Macron and friends' plans to send non-combatant troops into Ukraine. So something is definitely going on here. This could have something to do with the division of military districts across Russia and potentially decentralizing the chain of command in a nuclear sense between St. Petersburg and Moscow. My friends, I think the situation is far, far worse than we are being told. The haste and the consternation exhibited by some of the Western leaders, Macron in particular, lately with respect to these meetings and this sudden plan to deploy troops in Ukraine, tells me that they're worried about something that might be found should Russia potentially win this conflict. They're probably mostly worried about the existential monetary crisis that's going to ensue for Europe if they're completely cut off from Russian energy. And they need to get Putin out of there. They need to get a puppet government inside Russia so they can gain multinational control over all of those resources and reindustrialize. Now, here are some of the things to keep in mind that came out of the Paris conference. 5 points were outlined by Emmanuel Macron in terms of initiatives that they're going to embark on inside Ukraine. Okay, this just came out of the blue. They were not talking about this a few days ago. And you know, when something like this happens so rapidly, that means that there's a lot going on that we just don't know. 5 parts of the action plan, and notice the order of these things, okay? Cyber defense, they put that one first. I mean, that's obvious. They've always been involved in cyber defense. I think they just put one of those first because they want to sandwich the truth in the middle. Productions of weapon systems inside Ukraine. Why would you produce weapons inside Ukraine? I'm presuming that they're going to be doing that underground, in a deep underground military bunker somewhere, for which there is plenty in Ukraine to do that, because I could not see it being feasible or lucrative from a financial point of view for them to do that, for it just to be blown up by the Russians. Anyways, they've already had plans to do this anyways, but now they're basically moving it forward at an accelerated rate. They sandwich these two in there, okay? Moldova, they're going to help defend Moldova and other countries threatened by the Russian offensive. So they know that things are about to happen in Transnistria. they know that the Transnistrians are about to ask the Russians to be annexed. Whether or not the Russian obliges is anybody's guess. And they know that this could potentially bring Ukraine and Moldova into conflict on that front. So they've openly pledged now to help out Moldova. But the question is, who are these other countries that they're referring to? Okay, so they explicitly state one of the categories of action is to help Moldova and the defense of other countries threatened by the Russian offensive. Now, Macron was incredibly brief and vague in terms of this action plan that they're about to lay out, which is why you pretty much have to interpret the worst at this point. They're also going to be assisting with the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. Well, what does that mean, to assist with the Ukrainian-Belarusian border? How are they going to do that? Could it have something to do with the 100,000 troops they currently have partaking in Steadfast Defender at this very moment, not counting untold levels of other military exercises happening concurrently from Poland all the way up to Finland? I'm guessing so. They're also going to be partaking in what they're calling mine clearance operations. Mine clearance operations. So they're planning on sending troops in a non-combatant role to assist with border security between Ukraine and Belarus, but also to clear mines. Now, my question is this: if Ukraine was winning the war and pushing forward, it would make sense that they would need a lot of demining done. A lot of the places where you're going to find mines right now are in the places right around the war zone in the eastern part of Ukraine and in the northern border of Belarus. But why would you demine Belarus? Why would you demine the eastern part of Ukraine? Unless they're referring to demining the Black Sea. In such case, that means that NATO warships are going to have to go into the Black Sea. No matter how you slice it, though, all of this it basically assumes that you're on the offensive, because the minefields are either in the war zone or Russia has crossed the minefields and is now pushing into Ukraine on most fronts. So the only way you would demine is if you weren't defending anymore, which we know for an absolute fact Ukraine is defending. Every NATO country and Western media source admits that now, that Ukraine is on the back foot and being pushed back deeper and deeper. So if anything, you would be remining, not demining. You see what I'm saying? So what are these teams that are going to go there and demine actually do? Guys, this is all cover. This is all mission creep. They're getting ready to move troops into western part of Ukraine, exactly like we said they would for the last couple of months. Okay? It's all going to plan. Macron has explicitly stated that Putin cannot win this war. Why? I explained yesterday. A lot of this has to do with access to Russian resource and energy wealth in the country. And if they cannot have access to that, Europe's economy is going to crumble. It's already on the brink of crumbling and contracting. And austerity is rearing its head across numerous countries, some of which are already in a state of recession. Maybe they're planning on bringing back a war economy. Now, you'll notice the language out of the Paris conference. There were many countries, among them Sweden, the United States, Czechoslovakia, Poland. A lot of the big players had said, look, and Slovakia, Robert Fico explicitly expressed his concerns about this. They said, we don't want any part of sending troops into Ukraine. But you really have to read between the lines, because they're calling it now non-combative roles. They're going to call these roles peacekeeping roles. And it's important to remember, most of these countries already admit to having special forces on the ground for the purposes of auditing and assisting with the logistical aspects and maintenance of certain equipment. We admit that there are troops on the ground in Ukraine performing military duties. Now, they're not fighting on the front line per se, but they're most definitely helping the Ukrainians militarily in other ways. So this is just going to be an extension of that. Case in point, the UK is now saying that Britain has no plans for a large-scale deployment in Ukraine. Britain has no plan for a large-scale deployment of troops to Ukraine, a spokesperson for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said on Tuesday in response to Macron's comments about European nations sending troops to Ukraine. You notice the language there. They're not going to send a large-scale deployment just yet. And we know that we cannot trust these people on anything they say. So we know that if they're saying this now, they're likely just injecting it, getting people exposed to the idea. So when they finally do make good on it, it's not going to come as much of a shock. Okay, this is just time release. There was a time when sending Patriot was up for debate and was thought unthinkable. There was a time when sending tanks was unthinkable. Now the tanks are already getting blown up. You know what I'm saying? So it's just a matter of slowly but surely, incrementally bringing about this greater involvement in the conflict. Beyond the small number of personnel, they say, that we already have in the country supporting the armed forces of Ukraine. I mean, what does that mean? That means you're helping them in the war. So you're going to say, well, we're just training them, or we're just helping them maintain these weapons. You're part of the war. Okay, so there's no way to cut it. You're not a non-combatant when your job could be done by a Ukrainian soldier, and that frees them up to fight. While you might not be on the front line, your participation in the conflict in the rear makes you most definitely party to the conflict, but we're already party to the conflict by virtue of the fact that we're providing weapons and resources to fight the war. So we are indeed a target, and Russia has responded by saying that this is going to bring us to the brink of Armageddon. We haven't got any plans for a large-scale deployment, they say. So we know that they're full of you-know-what, and it's only a matter of time. Now, the United States has also echoed the same sentiment about sending troops to the United States, insisting that we are never going to send troops to Ukraine. And just recall what Joe Biden said about Afghanistan. I always go back to this because it's the perfect example where he explicitly stated a month before the withdrawal from Afghanistan that we are never going to withdraw. That's all the proof that you need to know that when their lips are moving, they're lying. And it's very likely at this point in time that they're most definitely planning on it. They're putting it in there so that when Russia gives them an excuse to have to put troops on the ground, they can almost have as an alibi to say, well, we never wanted to do this, but now you're making us do this. So what's likely going to happen is that there's going to be an incident with these non-combatant forces, and that is going to, and they're going to be a bit of a tripwire of sorts, so that eventually they'll have an excuse to go in a combative role because, you know, NATO peacekeeping forces are being slaughtered in Russia. That's exactly how this is all going to play out. And the Russians know it. They're not stupid, okay? And this is something that has been discussed for weeks. This deployment of troops, this is not new. We've been talking about this for months on the channel. It is only now that it's materializing, okay? And this whole thing with the peacekeepers, that's going to materialize next. So you're ahead of the curve. As much as Macron has said that there is no consensus, all of these other countries that have remained silent, these unnamed other 20 countries, there's no talk that they have disagreed to not put non-combatant troops or combatant troops on the ground for all we know. So while there was no consensus and there was pushback from this handful of countries, that tells you that there was probably a lot of countries who were on board with the idea of putting non-combative troops, and probably even some who are getting ready to put combative troops. Let's not kid ourselves. We have to look at what is happening on the ground. I've given you 101 data points to show you over the last 2 weeks with respect to Russia's preparation for war. I have a very well-informed source inside Poland. And here is what they're telling me today, on top of all the other stuff that I've talked about, that you really have to watch the channel on a daily basis, because I cannot reiterate this stuff every single day, okay? So basically, the Polish Minister of Education, Barbara Nowacka, has confirmed, I probably butchered that one, he didn't write it phonetically this time, that's okay, has confirmed that she is working with the Minister of Defense, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, I think he wrote that one phonetically, to fast-track ad hoc civil defense training in schools this year, something that the Russians are also doing as well. Civil defense training is code for we're going to prep for nuclear war and full-blown conventional war. This is due to a declared urgent need to connect with lack of knowledge by children on how to behave in crisis situations. Currently, a list of military personnel who work as instructors in schools is being prepared by the Ministry of Defense. So they're getting ready to go through with this, and this is fast-tracked, okay? This is all quick. All of these military changes, these rapid military changes in Poland, are very, very telling, because they know that they're going to be the next front of this war. Concurrently, the Polish Minister of Homeland Security, Marcin Karawiński, has announced that a process of vetting shelters and bunkers in schools will begin as soon as possible. Is there bunkers in schools in the United States and Canada? I don't think so. There's basements in some spots. Maybe there is in some places. Assessing if these facilities can accommodate all pupils and staff, and if they need any servicing or upgrading. So we know that the war is about to spread westward, okay, because the Russians are pushing westward in that direction. The question is the Ukrainian government going to crumble? If the Ukrainian government crumbles and capitulates to the Russians, and turncoats within the Ukrainian government seek to overthrow the current Ukrainian government, because we all know Vladimir Putin frames this as a civil war. Remember what the primary propagandists of Russian mainstream TV said just the other day. He explicitly stated that if this war goes to Poland, it's going to be a different kind of war. He wasn't speaking with respect to nuclear weapons, but he was saying that the reason why they're holding back in Ukraine is because they consider them brothers. They don't want to commit fratricide, but they are more than willing to do a shock and awe campaign, and they even use this comparison, much like the United States did in Iraq, if the war comes to Poland. They don't care about the Poles. So the Poles know this is going to be a much different conflict. And as the late Peter Pry once told me, former CIA agent who we had on the channel right before, or well, after the war started, but before things really got intense, he said that NATO is underestimating Russia's capability because the Ukrainians went to school with the Russians. They all trained with the Russians, and they understand the Russian way of war. And so the Russians are effectively, up until this point, have been fighting themselves, and now they're fighting themselves armed with NATO weapons. So to presume that we will fare as well as the Ukrainians is potentially very dangerously naive. So if the war goes to Poland, it's going to be a much bloodier conflict. And now that NATO is trying to get its tentacles into Western Ukraine, there is a gray area there where the war can easily spill over what soon will be a non-existent, very fluid border situation in Western Ukraine. Okay? So as much as Biden is promising not to put troops on the ground, the U.S. already has troops on the ground helping with all of those missile systems. In fact, the Russians have accused the United States in particular of utilizing the Patriot missile defense system to shoot down Russian planes. Okay? As I said, Moscow's response, commenting on Macron's words, the Kremlin said that such a development would inevitably lead to a direct military clash between Russia and NATO. The very fact of discussing the possibility of sending certain contingents to Ukraine was called by Presidential Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov an important new element. Well, that's a very euphemistic way of putting it. The Russians have no game when it comes to their media game. They're completely, because they're too focused on the the goals and the strategy of it all. They're very poor talkers. They don't have Hollywood. Sure, they write some interesting novels and stuff like that, but they're not really great storytellers. They're not very charismatic. So unfortunately, they never seize on opportunities like this in order to make a statement. And of course, they fail miserably once again. According to a former British Army officer, he has warned that we need to be prepared to commit boots on the ground in Ukraine, especially if the U.S. pulls out of NATO. The U.S. is not going to pull out of NATO, especially considering that Donald Trump had explicitly stated that he may not come to the aid. And this is all bluster, because look at his cheerleading of Lindsey Graham yesterday, saying he's one of his favorite people and he loves him and blah, 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 and clapping for him on stage and giving him high fives and all this stuff. Lindsey Graham is the biggest war hawk. This is the guy who wants to assassinate Putin, take out the Kremlin, decapitation strike, go to nuclear war, take out Iran. And this is the guy who Trump is buddy-buddy with, okay? So just keep that in mind. NATO is not going to abandon, especially the intermarium countries, which are in between Russia and the western part of Europe, because those are all the countries that pay more than their fair share. In fact, Poland is 4% of their GDP into NATO spending at this point, which is very significant. Poland is arming up like there is no tomorrow, and perhaps that means there may not be a tomorrow, so you should start preparing too. There has been more threats issued to Kaliningrad. If Russia dares to challenge NATO, Kaliningrad will be neutralized first. The previous false accusations of Russia that it is surrounded by NATO are now becoming a reality, said Lithuanian ambassador to Sweden. So Lithuania has a population of 2.8 million people. I'm pretty sure that they would be extinguished in an instant. I'm not surprised that it is they who is saying this, and I'm quite confident that the states that did support troop deployments into Ukraine are likely those countries, which is why they're rapidly building up their bunker networks on the border with Russia. There was another fact that I heard today from Bloomberg that North Korea has sent 6,700 containers with 3 million 152 millimeter shells to Russia. 3 million. Okay, the Russians, they were saying they were firing, what was it, something like 50,000 shells a day. Sometimes you hear these numbers and I think they're kind of exaggerated, to be brutally honest. But that would keep them busy, let's say, for a few months, okay? At least. Then you got to think, North Korea, if they're willing to give Russia 3 million shells, well, NATO is about to do, or not NATO, the United States, South Korea, and Japan are about to do even more military drills. And of course, we all know tensions on the Korean Peninsula are at an all-time high. Yeah, the fact that they're surrounded by U.S. nuclear submarines, by the South Koreans, and they're willing to get rid of 3 million artillery shells, and that's just only up until now. I mean, that tells you that no country is ever going to diminish their own supplies more than 10%. I don't think. I can't see it, especially in the situation they're in. So I'm guessing that, knowing like the North Korean craziness, I'm guessing that they probably got 100 million of these things in storage somewhere. And because all these guys have been doing is digging. We're going to have a guest on the channel tomorrow who's going to talk extensively about the North Korean underground. And it's going to be very interesting because apparently they have some of the deepest and biggest bunker complexes on Earth. Okay, what else do you have to do when you're isolated for so long? You build geostructures. You build, what are they called? Geoscrapers, skyscrapers underground, okay? Israel is going to be sending an early warning missile system to Ukraine, and this is likely going to incentivize the Russians to share more technology with the Iranians. So they plan to transfer early warning systems to Ukraine to protect against Russian missile strikes and drone attacks, according to Israel's UN ambassador. It is glad to share this potential with their Ukrainian friends, they say. So if they're going to be sending, even if it's defensive technology, and knowing what's going on, the tense situation in Syria, the situation that's about to explode in Lebanon. Today they launched like 200 rockets into Israel, and again, Israel responded. Massive explosions in the north. I don't know how they haven't called it a war yet, but it's a war. Okay, the IDF has called up 300,000 more reservists. I mean, it's on. So we know that situation is coming, and what this likely is going to do is cause Russia to take the gloves off and just say, hey, Iran, what do you need? Do you need some nukes? Do you need some more fighter jets? I mean, what do you need? We got it. And that's where this is where the lines between East and West become so firmly and strictly delineated at this point in time. And then I think once everybody officially knows what side they're on and there's no more diplomacy, that's when everything can just explode at once. And I think that's the risk with all of this. All of these multiple fronts forming, they all stem from the same dichotomy between East and West, whether it's Lebanon versus Israel, whether it's Ukraine versus Russia, Taiwan versus China, North Korea versus South Korea, Pakistan versus India. That one's a little bit more murky, but you know, Iran versus Israel. I mean, the African countries, Venezuela and the United States. So, and what is it called? Is it Ecuador? Ecuador. Anyways, they're all a part of the same dichotomous relationship, and the more entrenched either sides become in their views, and the greater the strategic partnerships militarily between said countries, then you start to see a situation in which if one of those situations explodes, the likelihood of all of the other theaters of war flaring up at the same time is incredibly high because the degree of interconnectedness is so much higher at that point. Not surprisingly, the government of Canada is introducing new legislation to combat harmful online content. And notice, I'm going to list off the changes that they're going to make, and notice how they sandwich attacks on free speech in between very, things that I agree with, points about protecting children, okay? So, Government of Canada is introducing legislation to combat hateful online content. The Online Harms Act will specifically target 7 categories of harmful content. Now, notice the order of operations here. Number 1, content that sexually victimizes children or re-victimizes a survivor. 100% agreement with that. Intimate content communicated without consent. 100% agreement with that as well. Content that foments hatred. Okay, I agree with that, but that's kind of ambiguous because we all know that can be utilized and weaponized in ways when the government wants it to suppress dissidents as well. Legitimate dissidents who are in fact not hateful. Okay, yes, there are some hateful groups out there, but oftentimes, okay. So number 4 is content that incites violent extremism or terrorism. Again, this is a slippery slope because what is violence? What is extremism? What is terrorism? Content that incites violence. And then they wrap it up. Okay, so those 3 ones sandwiched in the middle, those were the attacks on free speech. The 6 is content used to bully a child, which I totally agree with. And number 7, content that induces a child to harm themselves. So you notice, look at the order of that. They put the 2 things that affect mostly children at the start. Then they sandwich the 3 free speech suppressions in the middle. And then at the end, they go back to the children. Okay? Obligations related to these 7 categories of harmful content would be organized under 3 duties. The duty to act responsibly, the duty to protect children. Of course, it's always about the children. They don't care about the children. And the duty to make certain content inaccessible. We already know that they set the stage with Bill C-11. So the question is, who determines what content foments hatred? Who determines what content incites violence? Okay, is Is it like you say something and then somebody gets angry and then they go and make a video and then maybe that video makes someone a little angrier? I mean, how long down the supply chain are we going here, or how they're going to go? Does it have to be a direct incitation of violence? Yeah, I would totally agree with that as well. Most of this stuff on the surface we all agree with, but we need to understand that it's written so ambiguously that they can weaponize it at a moment's notice. And they're doing this now because, of course, this is happening. Because this is happening, they need to get control of social media. Okay? That's all I got for you guys today. I gotta get going. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is support local business. Shop at CanadianPreparedness.com, and I know we might not be local to you, but we're not a big box store. We're not a Walmart. We're not an Amazon, but we have good service. We have premium products that you can't find anywhere else, certainly not all under one roof, and we got very good shipping options and good prices as well. So go check it out. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care.